Are you considering fixing and flipping houses in Maryland? There are a lot of variables to consider, but here are some tips that hopefully will help you. My name is Jason Balin from Hard Money Bankers. I've lent on over 4,000 projects since we started our private lending and hard money lending business in 2007. So, first, what's your experience? You got to be realistic. If you're a first time flipper compared to a real estate investor who's flipped hundreds of properties, they're clearly going to have an advantage, not just experience, but they're going to have different resources, different vendors, things that can help them that you might not know. Now, that's okay. If you never flipped a house before, you got to start somewhere, and I definitely encourage you to take action and do so. But you do have to be realistic. And I'm gonna give you an example. You might not want to mess with maybe an older historic property that's in the city of Frederick, or maybe you don't want to mess with a huge gut renovation project in Baltimore City where the average property was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s. You just got to be careful. As soon as you start opening up those walls, you don't know what you don't know, right? And construction costs will creep up, and it's just more risky compared to maybe newer areas like Columbia, Maryland, which is in Howard County, and some other areas. So it's just something to consider. Risk versus rewards. So number two, how much funds do you have that you're looking to contribute? To be honest, it's hard to fix and flip a house if you have zero of your own money. Now I'm all about other people's money, OPM, but you got to be realistic if you can get your hands on doing so. Now, typically, it makes sense to plan for about 30% of your own funds set aside for a project for a typical fix and flip. Now that can and that's 30% of your costs. So your purchase and your renovation costs. So example, you buy a property for 200 grand and needs $100,000 in renovations. That's 300 grand. I would plan to have about 30% of that or $90,000 available between down payments that you need either with a hard money lender or a bank, monthly payments, construction overages, reserves, holding costs. It's good to have that. An asset will turn into a liability very, very quickly if you don't have enough cash to kind of get through this. And there's always cost overruns. And again, if you have less available than that amount, maybe just purchase a less expensive property or consider bringing in a cash partner to help with that. There's no shame in that. Okay. Number three, risks on different areas. Um, Obviously, the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. And we kind of talked about this earlier. But some areas that offer high rates of return also may have higher risks. Now, that could be because they're just older properties and not many people want to mess with that. A lot of people want to do what they've called like lipstick on a pig project. They go into a property, they update the bathrooms, they update the kitchens, carpet, paint, landscaping, siding, new roof, and they're not messing with major mechanicals. They're not opening up walls. They're not doing major renovations. Now, if the property was built like in the 70s or sooner, you can do that. You're not really going to be able to do that on an old Baltimore City property or an old historic property in downtown Frederick and things like that. It's just more challenging to do. There's older stuff. They have old, out of date stuff that needs to be replaced. It's a full gut renovation. So usually a full gut renovation, because there's a lot of risk, you should be able to make a substantial return on that, right? But what comes risk, what comes higher reward. But again, it's kind of your preference on that. So, as you're doing your research, you'll know what neighborhoods are newer style neighborhoods, what neighborhoods are older style. And typically when you get into, urban areas and cities, they're older style properties compared to suburban areas where they're newer style properties. So number 4, do your homework. Go to investment groups, RIA groups, meetup groups. Talk to every single person you can. They will give you their insight. A lot of real estate investors share information with you. They want everybody to succeed. Real estate agents, other real estate investors, hard money lenders, title companies, mortgage brokers, maybe. Anyone kind of appraisers, auctioneers, anyone who's in this space and in these areas. Now, I'll tell you something that's interesting. So, where I'm located in Maryland, my office is, in Howard County, Maryland, which is between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Those are two different markets. And a lot of Washington, D.C. investors don't mess with Baltimore, and a lot of Baltimore investors don't mess with Washington, D.C. because you really need to know the areas and know the vendors and the resources and what works and what doesn't work in there. So do your homework and really learn the areas. And there's no shortcut better than talking to as many people as you can. Personally, I like to invest in newer areas. I believe there's less risk. It's a quicker turnaround time. I can get in and out, make my profits, and move it. I don't like doing massive renovations and longer term projects in older areas that just have a lot of unknowns to them. I just personally don't. I'm not saying there's not a lot of opportunity in there. I know lots of real estate investors who have fixed and flipped hundreds or maybe even thousands of properties in the Baltimore City area, and they're very successful. They know the areas very well. They know them block by block. Personally, I like staying in areas like Howard County, where our office is. It's a newer area. There's not super old properties. I don't think there's stuff older than the 70s. Well, at least in subdivisions, there's some older stuff outside of subdivisions. But I like dealing with properties in the 70s and the 80s and things like that. You kind of know what you're up against. The stuff that's built. I flipped properties that have been built in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and they turned out to be a little bit more scary. But again, it's risk versus reward. I know that the majority of the stuff in the newer areas, the difference between a fully renovated house and a property that needs complete renovation, the margins aren't that big, right? You might be able to buy the worst property for $500,000 in a neighborhood, and the best property might only be $650,000 in that neighborhood in a county like Howard County or a newer area. And then you might be at Baltimore City, and the worst property might be $100,000, and the best property might be $650,000. So there's and that worst property might have to be torn down. They might have tons of violations. So it's just risk versus reward and what your tolerance is. If you ever want to chat about fix and flip in general, the fix and flip market in Maryland, just hit me up. hardmoneybankers.com, Jason at hardmoneybankers.com, 240-994-2284. Hopefully you found this information on fixing and flipping houses in Maryland